those of you who have been with this channel for a while will know that I am a huge Genesis fan. But there is one Genesis album that I have never discussed, and that is 1969's From Genesis to Revelation, their first album. And there's a pretty good reason for that. Primarily the fact that, you know, this album is... It just doesn't sound like Genesis. You know, it sounds like second-rate Bee Gees imitations and some Moody Blues in the background. It's not bad, but it's very, very second-rate. And the thing is, I can't really even blame them. You know, they were very young when they made this album. I think they were like 15 and 17 when they signed the recording contract. I mean, they were very young. Fresh out of school, you know, they came from a very, very posh school over in the UK. Genesis are posh. I mean, that's just the facts, you know. And they actually got the deal through connections via that school of a very unpleasant man whose name I'm not ever going to mention in this video because of the reasons that have been outlined in that cutaway I just showed. And yeah, it's as I said, it's not good, it's not bad, it's a decent set of songs that show a lot of potential but don't ever actually reach to that next level that even on the next album was very apparent they were capable of reaching. And as such, it's basically just a curiosity, you know. Some people really dislike this album. I think I have gone on record as saying that I thought it was like on the same level as Calling All Stations, which I have to call past me out on that. That is not true. I don't know what I was on at the time. Before I go into the track reviews, I should probably talk about the lineup, because it's not quite the lineup you know, but by the same token, it's not like a Jethro Tull type deal where the lineup was totally different in the beginning and things just were in a constant state of flux. It's Peter Gabriel, Mike Rutherford, Tony Banks, Anthony Phillips, and John Silver, who was only their drummer for this album. One of two drummers they had before Phil Collins. Actually, I think three if you count Chris Stewart, who I don't think made it onto this album at all, but I think he did some of their very early stuff. I don't know. If I get my early Genesis drummers mixed up, you feel free to correct me in the comments. But anyway, I think that's really all I need to say before we get into the actual reviews of the songs on this album. So the album opens up with When the Sour Turns to Sweet, a wonderful piano-based track that eventually gets some horns and becomes sort of a different thing. It's very, very 60s, but it's that other side of the 60s that, you know, we don't hear so much now. That kind of commercialized version of the 60s. It's not the prime time stuff, not the stuff that lingers in the cultural memory, but the sort of riding the coattails, the commercial version of the Bee Gees, who were, to some extent, you could argue, already a commercialized version of contemporary Beatles, at least when they started out. But, anyway, it's a good track. It's a good album opener. Gabriel gives a good performance. Everyone else is in fine form. So track 2 is In the Beginning, and it is an immediate improvement over the first track. It's kind of B-grade psychedelia about the creation of the universe. In theory, this album is supposed to be a concept album about the Bible. In practice, only a few songs actually play along with that concept. And the ones that do mostly limit themselves to the Book of Genesis, and more specifically the early parts of the Book of Genesis, specifically the Garden of Eden story. Genesis would touch on the Book of Revelations later on, but we'll get to that in good time. Anyway, like I said, this is great. There's a strong flavoring via the guitar, and I love the cool, insistent bass throughout the track. I really like this. It's a gentle ballad. It's maybe just a little bit silly, especially that chorus, but like I said, I like it. It's one of the stronger songs. I really like the intro to this track. It's really cool, guitar-based. You know, very compelling. I love that almost Monty Python and the Holy Grail coconut clip-clopping in the background. And then the song becomes something completely different, which I also really like. It's, again, another psychedelic rock track. I would say I'm about 90% sure this is supposed to be about Adam in the garden before the fall. But like I said, most of what's on this album is very oblique or not about the theme at all. And this is probably the only one where I can say 100% this is what it's about. Am I Very Wrong is a pleasant, mildly folksy Baroque pop thing. In my notes, I've written that it's possibly about the fall of man, but the last time I went through this album, I was pretty sure that that's not at all what it's about. The one thing I always remember about this track, though, is that the choruses are complete Moody Blues knockoffs. Like, this sounds like they are trying so hard. This is another really good sort of wannabe Lush thing. This time it reminds me a lot more of the Zombies and their approach to this sort of 60s music. It also reminds me just a little bit of Timetable from Foxtrot, but I'm probably getting ahead of myself there. This is one of the very best tracks on the album. You have a great, insistent piano melody, and the lyrics are classic Gabriel weirdness. In Hiding perhaps takes us back to the biblical themes once again. You could perhaps read this track about being man gaining free will after eating from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but again, re-listening to it now, I think it's more about a young person, perhaps the age of Genesis at the time, sort of gaining independence, going out on your own, doing something different from what your parents, your teachers, society in general, whatever, have prescribed for you. I think that's more what the song is about than any sort of biblical allegory. This is a song of unrequited love and yearning. You could read it as being about Adam and Eve, but again, I think the connection is very tenuous, and I think this is going to be the last time I make that point in this video. It's great stuff, though. I always forget about this track. Basically, every time I listen to the album, I wound up forgetting about this one. It's pretty, but it's not very memorable. This track is a lot better, though. It's more Gabriel weirdness in its embryonic form. Once again, sounding just a bit like the Zombies, but those horns remind me weirdly of Chicago, which is not a connection I think I've ever made about Genesis before this track or after it. Silent Sun is yet another track of longing and unrequited love. It's one of the strongest tracks on the album, maybe the strongest, honestly, and from what I understand, was one of the earliest recorded during these sessions in a very deliberate attempt to copy the Bee Gees, and I have to say it succeeds. It's a good track. I wish the mix was better, but it's a good track. That could go for all of this album. As I know I said it in the intro, but this mix is abominable. This is one of the worst stereo mixes I've ever heard on an album made after the point in time when people were supposed to know how to make stereo mixes. What on earth was... The first half of this track I like a lot. It's a very brief piano ballad with some great Gabriel weirdness. I think about a child preparing to be born, but I'm not really sure. The second half I like a little bit less so. I do enjoy it. I think it's a suitable, perhaps, conclusion to the album. But I also, another part of me thinks that it doesn't really earn the sort of overarching grandiosity that it incredibly inadequately grasps at. That would have to wait for later on. This album is decent. I think I would rank it somewhere between a high 5 and a solid 6, but I really couldn't go any higher. It's got some great tracks on here, individual. I think The Serpent is a very, very strong track, as is Silent Sun and In Hiding. But overall, it suffers a lot from the genericism. There's a sense I get when I'm listening to this that I could be listening to any young, inexperienced B-grade 60s band produced by somebody who had not produced a lot of records before. In fact, while I was listening to it, I found my thoughts often wandering to another great 70s band's awkward late 60s debut album, and that would be the first self-titled Caravan album, which is an album that I think is much better than this one. And I think that's mostly because, while it's a little bit rough and embryonic, it has its own sound. And this really doesn't, you know. There's not a lot besides Gabriel's vocals and Banks' keys tying this to later Genesis. It's on its own, and while I enjoy it and while I think it's a little underrated by the fans a lot of the time, I can't really blame anybody for not listening to this, especially considering who produced it. But it's still good though, and if you are a fan, you should definitely hear this once. But it is basically a novelty. Essentially anybody could have written these songs, and if you want to jump straight to Trespass, you absolutely can do that. But until then, have a nice day. I honestly don't know what the next video is going to be. It could be a couple different things. I have a lot of different ideas and plans about what the future brings. So yeah, just hold tight for the moment. But until then...